die üblichen Standardmessmethoden zur Sprechgeschwindigkeit.
So thank you very much again for attending today's webinar. I will be your moderator today. My name is Katerina Anastasiou, and I am the facilitator for Transform Europe, the political foundation affiliated with the European Left Party in the European Parliament. Transform Europe is also a network of leftist think tanks and institutes around Europe, with 39 organizations from 23 countries participating on the field of political education and critical analysis. The focus of my work for Transform Europe is on the topics of migration, global strategy, and peace, and this is also the reason why I'm here moderating today. Now, for those that just joined, because we have 10 attendees more than before, short technicalities. We seem to have right now a problem with the chat. You can use the Q&A function to communicate with us. This is also where I'm going to fish the questions out of later on. And I will do an effort to try to fix the chat. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do that. Now, our webinar today will last maximum until 8 o'clock. In the first round, we will be hearing from 4 speakers in 15 minutes intervals. This will be followed by a second round where the speakers will enter dialogue with each other. And the last 30 minutes are reserved for questions from the audience, you taking the time to be with us today. Again, to address the speakers with your questions, use the Q&A button. And as you have by now noticed, we are recording this session in audio and video, and it will be available in the next days. So now coming to today's webinar titled Christian and Marxist Approaches of Peace Ethic, Part 1. We had a long preparation period for this webinar, discussing on how to kick off this dialogue on peace and approaches to peace from the Marxist and Christian point of view. And at the end of the day, we realized that there are 3 let's say, main questions we need to tackle in this first webinar of the 3-part series. We will be discussing what is actually required of ethics in terms of peace building, what is the role of ethics during conflict and war, how does ethics shape our future, the way we vision our future and we act upon that vision, and in what way Marxist thought and Christian faith have commonalities that open space to actual societal peace building. So for this cause, and without further ado, I will be introducing now our first speaker, dear colleague of ours, Axel Gehring from the Institute of Critical Social Analysis of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. Axel is a fellow at the Institute of Critical and Social Analysis in Berlin. He's covering foreign policy, peace, and security policy. He's coming from the field of political economy, state theory, and hegemony, and his research has been extended into the field of international relations, where he tries to utilize a neo-Gramscian approach in the way he sees and analyzes the developments. His areal focus lies on the EU and the Mediterranean neighborhood. Furthermore, he has been working on armament industries and military-society relations. Axel today will kick off the webinar by giving us a first introduction, sharing his thoughts on how capitalism sets limits to peace building and how important it is to be aware of capitalism when discussing peace. So Axel, without further ado, the microphone is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. Ethically, liberalism constituted itself as a premise of the liberation of the individual from the feudal order. And the premise of the liberation of the individual and its creation as a category went hand in hand through the process of enlightenment. With the idea of the individual, a new form of emphasis on its protection from harm and violence is made. This is very important to the question of war and peace. as violence may be the strongest form of harm humans can enact against each other. But historically, we also know capitalism and enlightenment emerged together in close entanglement. Consequently, there are limits within classical enlightenment thinking. And also, namely, capitalism has not consciousness about itself. And also the classical Enlightenment philosophy had no insight into its driving laws. So liberal philosophers like Adam Smith, who was also an Enlightenment philosopher, were talking about the invisible hand of the markets. In other words, there is no immanent consciousness within the classical early capitalist thinking that capitalism is capitalism. So, and capitalist thinking itself neutralizes market behavior and fetishizes commodities. So I would say that classical Enlightenment philosophy and also many religions were or are highly ethical when it comes toward judging forms of personal rule, or for developing and promoting visions of justice. But their field is not to see and to analyze the modus operandi of capitalism, even when they are well aware about its consequences and they are judging them. So for understanding capitalism and its driving laws, the method of Marxism has been developed. And it goes beyond the level of appearance. It decodifies the laws behind the invisible hand. What distinguishes Marxism from explicitly ethical approaches is that a normative, rather moralist argumentation is replaced by a more socio-analytical argumentation. So I will now avoid to go too much into the details of Marxist value theory. Many scholars would be better qualified for this than me. So I will rather talk more on the concrete consequences of the invisible hand, or let's say how capitalism sets limits to peace building. But what are core elements of the Marxist argumentation or argumentations? Of course, I will not limit all limits set by capitalism to peace. And I do not know them all, and we cannot know them all, as capitalist laws are abstract, but only exist in concrete, and the concrete itself exists in many complex articulations. Discovering and understanding them is an enduring endeavor. Maybe the most prominent visibility in classical Marxist discourses on war and peace have gained the classical theories on imperialism. And there it is stated that the imperialist competition is arising from the capitalist mode of production. And this has been already 1 century ago identified as a central cause of modern war. But what is imperialism and from where derives it? In its very core, the capitalist mode of production produces commodities with the aim of profit. The profit is used to produce new commodities on even larger scale and so on. And the laborers who are also constituting a living commodity are producing more than they earn. So in consequence, there is a problem of underconsumption. Not only the quest for raw materials, but the need to sell commodities constitutes a tendency to enter markets which are unexplored so far, because the local market itself is already explored. And very limited due to the structural problem of underconsumption. In case of colonialism, we know this happened violently, and this took already place in the early stage of capitalist development, and it also helped to establish capitalism fully in its centers as well, not only in the colonized place. And we also know that in the further stages of capitalist development, these expansive tendencies are not only about opening new markets for competition. Given the homegrown monopolistic trusts, opportunities to expand into unexplored markets became a mean state policy when the globalization of the 19th century was in a crisis. And that led to a direct state confrontation. So this direct state confrontation, when the access to markets was very much state-mediated, was what we had at the turn from the 19th to 20th century, and was one of the causes for the First World War. But from the 20th century, we also know that the world market can be granted by one single superpower. So, for example, the US were accepted as such a power in the capitalist hemisphere for decades. But that was the result of the two preceding imperialist world wars, namely the failure of the German imperialism, which led to the establishment of one single world market under hegemony of one player instead of competing visions. So what we saw in the 20th century was that the tendency of competing imperialisms and thereby of its potential wars between industrial states was collectively administrated and calmed under US hegemony, but it never disappeared. After 1990, under the edges of one expanding world markets, the political conditions were laid down for a new race between economic superpowers. And the biggest structural for peace is nowadays the melange between a stagnating globalization, also again a global market, which has a tendency to fall apart into different markets and rising state competition. Therefore, the question, can the risk of war disappear so long as the class antagonism, which is a latent tendency toward violence, is still very relevant? And it might be identified as a really big problem for Marxian peace ethics. But we also have to see that the relation between capitalism and peace is not only a relation of war between states. The picture would be incomplete, because in many societies, there is the question of capitalism and peace located beyond the level of interstate war. It pops up wherever common means of agrarian production for the commons are sacrificed for enclosures on behalf of making profit. Means of primitive accumulation are often combined with open violence and crime, as they are literally closing the commons which are used for the people for their daily reproduction. While this social process is already violent on the structural level, it tends to become immediately violent when confronted with a political resistance. Many nowadays legal relations have this violent history, and this is still present even when it is forgotten. Therefore, the violence which is induced by capitalist relation or by the socio-political process of introducing capitalist relations shall be seen also as a limit for reaching societal peace even below the state level. And often it contributes to civil wars in states of the capitalist periphery. One may even argue that what is described by many liberal theories as a failed state is a society which undergoes a rapid process of primitive accumulation, so rapid that it unhinges the existing structures of the peripheral state. We should not mix the violently articulated crisis of the concrete previously given state order with the failure of the state itself. Sooner or later, the violently introduced property relations will be codified, new form of state established. I have to drink something because of my voice. And finally, we have to confess there are many capitalist states in which the societal relations are more peaceful or have even based on a deep integration of the lower classes into building and formulating a more inclusive social consent. Nevertheless, we shall put this picture into perspective. There is a link between a rather peaceful or violent societal relation in a capitalist society and its position in the global division of labor. Extractive, labor-intensive, low profitable, as well as highly pollutive commodity production has been often outsourced in the peripheries and the semi-peripheries, where the capital not necessarily benefits from higher productivity, but from more violent class relation, allowing a higher exploitation of the absolute surplus value, or simply allowing to break resistances more directly. To put in a nutshell, the rather peaceful relations in some states of the center were built or are still built on exporting their domestic potential of violence. Once exported into the periphery, the latent violence appears in its manifest form. And so far, I have only talked indirectly about direct colonial rule when it's coming towards introducing primitive accumulation. So the anti-colonial struggles found themselves in tension between acting ethically and peacefully to get rid of direct colonial rule and doing it violently when the colonial rules refused to go, or namely the rulers refused to go. And as I already mentioned, most of the post-colonial states found themselves after their liberation from direct colonial rule as parts of the capitalist periphery, which is not only struggling with the violent heritage from post-colonial nation building, but also, as mentioned above, with the violence imported via the links of the contemporary global capitalist labor division. In short, we see a tension which is very difficult to bridge between a normatively founded categorical imperative of peace and a socio-analytical formulated question on how the categorical imperative of peace is achievable. Can the normative demand for peace create peace at all if the given circumstances are ultimately relations of violence? Normative ethics and Marxist analysis do not naturally want to find each other, at least not when it is defined as central to overcome those contradictions which are causing the antagonisms, even against the will of the people in power. But I would not accuse exclusively Marxism for being cynical in respect of neglecting the categorical imperative of peace. We know that bourgeois international relations theories are basically more cynical because overcoming these contradictions which are causing these dilemmas are not their agenda. So Marxian thinkers, I would call in this respect Bertolt Brecht, had this problem always in their mind. Even their impetus to change the social relations came not only from the desire to overcome capitalism or capitalist class rule, but from the specific problem to act ethically under unethical social relation. In his parable, The Good Man of Szechuan, Brecht dealt with what happens, with what contradictions and impasses appear when subjects want to act ethically on an individual level. Even when trying, they are still subjected to the laws of capitalism, and acting with good intention can lead to the opposite result when the invisible hand of the market is in present acted. States in the international system are objected to such ramifications on an even larger scale. Postulating in a capitalist world the theory of liberal peace is ignoring the macro-scale ramifications of The Good Man of Szechuan, but there remains the question, shall we overthrow the impetus of liberal peace? Shall we throw it away, or shall we rather go further and say this impetus is highly important, but the problem, like with many Enlightenment premises, is it cannot be realized under the given capitalist society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Axel, for this update. Thank you. Without further ado, I will actually proceed and introduce our next speaker, so we have enough time later to interact a little bit more. So it's my honor to welcome also Petra Steinmair-Pösel. She's a social ethicist, currently director of the KPH Edith Stein Innsbruck Institute. Main areas of her interest and research are social ethics in the gravitational field of mysticism and politics, social ethical questions in the field of tension between economy, sustainability, ecology, gender issues, mimetic theory, religious and political education. From Petra, we will hear an introduction on the developments of peace ethics of the Catholic Church and faith in the last years, and it's a nice addition now to the introduction into the peace ethics, or the absence thereof, in Marxist thought we just heard from Axel. So Petra, the floor is yours for the next 15 minutes.
Thank you, Kat, for this kind introduction. And I have brought a PowerPoint to help you follow, and I'm going to share my screen so that everyone can see that. I hope it is visible now. So I was invited to speak about developments in Catholic peace ethics in my contribution today. And given the shortness of time, this is only possible in very broad outlines. I will thereby essentially draw on a paper by Wolfgang Palaver, who is also here tonight, a paper in which he dealt with the Ukraine war as a challenge to ecclesial peace ethics And I'm also going to draw a little bit on a contribution by Markus Vogt, who undertakes a revision of Christian peace ethics in view of the Ukrainian war, under the title being Christian in a Fragile World. So let us have a look, and I'll try to go to the next slide. So let us have a look at the very beginning of the Christian history. The first 2 centuries of the Christian church were characterized basically by non-violence and a distance to military violence. Decisive for this were the prophetic visions of a messianic kingdom of peace in the Hebrew Bible and Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, with its call to love one's enemies and not to respond to violence with counter-violence. Because the church in this very early period was a socially marginalized group which had no share in political power, this practice of non-violence could largely determine the lives of Christians. With the Constantinian turn, however, Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire and was thus forced to abandon this attitude of non-violence and consequently replaced it by a doctrine of just war, which also wanted to limit warlike violence, but could no longer take a fundamentally reductionist, that is, a pacifist stance. Building on Roman philosophers like Cicero, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and Spanish scholastics developed a differentiated doctrine, which laid down exactly which criteria allowed to enter into war, the so-called jus ad bellum, the right to go to war, and which conduct must be observed in war, the so-called jus in bello, the law in war. The older tradition of non-violence was not completely lost, as, for example, Saint Francis of Assisi or the practice of the historic peace churches show, but this non-violent approach then became marginalized. This position of peace ethics then changed in the 20th century after the devastating experiences and the millions of deaths caused by 2 world wars, and above all, the 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It had become obvious that the enormous destructive power of modern weapon systems questions the means of war fundamentally. The subsequent developments in Catholic peace ethics must be seen here against the background of international developments. And thus, let me mention some of them. On the level of international politics, already in 1928, the Briand-Kellogg Pact, officially the General Treaty for Renunciation of War, was an instrument of national policy, had declared an outlawing of war. In this international agreement on peace, the signatory states, initially Germany, France, the US, and soon later most other states, promised not to use war to resolve disputes or conflicts of whatever nature or whatever origin they may be, which may arise among them. Unfortunately, as we all know, it was not able to prevent the Second World War, but it was the base for trial of Nazi leaders later on in 1946. And its prohibition of war also lies at the heart of the Charter of the United Nations adopted in 1945, which in its preamble emphasizes the determination to protect future generations from the scourge of war. Wars of aggression were thus prohibited, and according to Article 51, military defense is only permitted in the event of an unlawful attack. According to the UN Charter, collective security is intended to secure peace in the world or to restore it in the event of a state breaking the treaty. This concept of peace guaranteed by law had to accept compromises with political reality from its very outset, because in the Security Council, the decisive security policy body of the UN, The 5 nuclear powers, China, France, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, later Russia, and the US, as permanent members have a veto right. And during the Cold War, this instrument was suspended because the Soviet Union and the Western powers blocked each other. After the Cold War, collective security became effective only once, when in 1991, the Security Council approved a coalition led by the United States to militarily liberate Kuwait, which had been annexed by Iraq. Mikhail Gorbachev was still president of the Soviet Union, and he advocated a peaceful world order after the end of the Cold War. The Catholic Church then followed this development and decided in the Second Vatican Council that violence was only permitted in the case of defense. And I quote from Gaudium et Spes, 79, you can read it here. As long as the danger of war remains and there is no competent and sufficiently powerful authority at the international level, governments cannot be denied the right to legitimate defense once every means of peaceful settlement has been exhausted. State authorities and others who share public responsibility have the duty to conduct such grave matters soberly and to protect the welfare of the people entrusted to their care. But it is one thing to undertake military action for the just defense of the people and something else again to seek the subjugation of other nations. Nor, by the same token, does the mere fact that war has unhappily begun mean that all is fair between the warring parties. At the same time, there was also increased recourse to the tradition of non-violence. Thus, for the first time, the Council granted a right to conscientious objection to military service. The First World Synod of Bishops in 1971 then explicitly stated that the strategy of non-violence should be promoted. I quote from the Justitia in Mundo, "It is absolutely necessary that international conflicts should not be settled by war, but that other methods better befitting human nature should be found. That a strategy of non-violence be fostered also, and a conscientious objection be recognized and regulated by law in each nation." In 1983, during an intensified phase of the Cold War, also the Catholic bishops of the US issued a pastoral letter on the ethics of peace, in which they emphasized that in the current world situation, the doctrine of just war must be complemented by the tradition of non-violence. I quote, "While the just war teaching has clearly been in possession for the past 1,500 years of Catholic thought, the new moment in which we find ourselves sees the just war teaching and non-violence as a distinct but interdependent methods of evaluating warfare. They diverge on some specific conclusions, but they share a common presumption against the use of force as a means of settling disputes. Both find their roots in the Christian theological tradition. Each contributes to the full moral vision we need in pursuit of a human peace. We believe the two perspectives support and complement one another, each preserving the other from distortion. Finally, in an age of technological warfare, analysis from the viewpoint of non-violence and analysis from the viewpoint of just war teaching often converge and agree in their opposition to methods of warfare which are in fact indistinguishable from total warfare. In recent decades, the traditional doctrine of just war was often replaced by the concept of just peace. With this concept, firstly, peace is emphasized as an end as opposed to the means of war. Just peace also includes the understanding that peace is not only the absence of war, but, understood as a broad concept, must also include social justice. This broad concept not only takes into account all forms of physical violence, but also focuses its attention on structural violence and its deeper causes. Thus, this broader view aims at overcoming the underlying causes of violence. With the concept of just peace, attention shifts from the immediate containment of violence or war to the long-term prevention of violence. The moral social justice is realized at the national and international levels, the less likely it is that non-violent conflicts or wars will break out. Thirdly, just peace also requires the primacy of non-violent methods of conflict resolution. While for a long time, forms of non-violent resistance remained marginal, in the course of the 20th century, they have increasingly gained importance. The non-violent liberation of India by Mahatma Gandhi and his Muslim ally Abdul Ghaffar Khan, and the non-violent struggle against racism in the US by Martin Luther King are extremely powerful examples of this new form of conflict resolution. In his message for the World Day of Peace 2017, titled Non-Violence, the Style for a Policy for Peace, Pope Francis additionally mentions Laima Gobi and thousands of Liberian women who, by means of prayer and nonviolent protests, ended the Second Civil War in Liberia. Moreover, two researchers have conducted an empirical study for the period from 1940 to 2006, in which they studied the impact of nonviolent resistance versus violent forms in over 300 cases. And they come to the conclusion that nonviolent resistance was twice as successful in achieving partial or full peace. So while the concept of just peace, emphasizing the primacy of nonviolence, it does not exclude the use of violence to protect innocent victims of violence. To this end, the United Nations adopted the concept of the responsibility to protect. The compendium of the social doctrine of the Church also emphasizes this obligation, stating, I quote, "The right to use force for purposes of legitimate defense is associated with the duty to protect and help innocent victims who are not able to defend themselves from acts of aggression." The peace ethic of Pope Francis finally is completely in line with this development from just war theory to just peace. And his message for the World Day of Peace in 2017 underlines this. I quote, "In the most local and ordinary situations and in the international order, may nonviolence become the hallmark of our decisions, our relationships and our actions, and indeed of political life in all its forms." However, this attitude must not be misinterpreted as a partisanship for an absolute pacifism. Pope Francis does not want to eliminate the criteria of the doctrine of just war, which aim at limiting violence, but to supplement them with active non-violence. This is also the perspective from which the ethical sections of his most recent social encyclical, Fratelli, tutti, about which Connie is speaking later on, must be read. With this encyclical, he distances himself from the doctrine of just war, pointing in particular to the repeated misuse of its criteria to legitimize wars. It is not the criteria, however, that are the problem, but their misuse. And I quote, "War can easily be chosen by invoking all sorts of allegedly humanitarian, defensive, or precautionary excuses, and even resorting to the manipulation of information. In recent decades, every single war has been ostensibly justified." And then I omit that on the slide, but I will read it to you. He says, "The Catechism of the Catholic Church speaks of the possibility of legitimate defense by means of military force, which involves demonstrating that certain rigorous conditions of moral legitimacy have been met. Yet it is easy to fall into an overly broad interpretation of this potential right. In this way, some would also wrongly justify even preventive attacks or acts of war that can hardly avoid entailing evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. At issue is whether the development of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons and enormous and growing possibilities offered by new technologies have granted war an uncontrollable destructive power over great numbers of innocent civilians. In view of this, it is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. It should be added that with increased globalization, what might appear as an immediate or practical solution for one part of the world initiates a chain of violent and often latent effects that end up harming the entire planet and opening the way to new and worse wars in the future. In today's world, there are no longer just isolated outbreaks of war in one country or another. I think what we are experiencing right now in the Ukraine underlines the danger of spatial and temporal escalations of war, as the Pope mentions in Fratelli, tutti. Summing up, it can be said, weapons alone can win war, but never peace. What is also needed is a constant vigilance and early identification of violence and human rights violations wherever they spread in everyday life. Equally indispensable are diplomatic and civil society initiatives of resistance at all levels, as well as a demythologization of supposed justifications of war through nationalist identity constructions. Where democracy and the rule of law are weakened and semi-publics are manipulated in the digital world, early criticism is needed, as nationalist, aggressive thought patterns can emerge in their shadows. A just peace also requires avoiding generalized or demonized images of the enemy and always seeking anew the power of reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much, Petra. And also thank you for opening the way to the next speaker. You see, I'm a little bit pushing with time, but it's just because I want us to have the discussion later. So I have the honor to introduce one of my favorite colleagues, Cornelia Hildebrandt. Cornelia is together with Marga Ferret from the European Citizens Foundation, the co-president of Transform Europe. She's a consultant on parties and social movements, as well as issues regarding ideological dialogue in the Institute of Critical and Social Analysis of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. Cornelia is also one of the co-founders, one of the first people engaging in DIALOP, in the dialogue between Christians and Marxists. And today, she will give us her insight by exploring the social encyclical that was mentioned before by Petra, Fratelli, tutti, issued by Pope Francis on the 3rd of October 2022. And she will give us a radical left perspective of the text. Cornelia, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Kat, also for your introduction. And I will speak about Fratelli tutti from the left perspective. That means I speak about the political love and responsibility. I start with the Fratelli tutti. On the 3rd of October 2020, under the impression of the corona pandemic, Pope Francis signed his new social encyclical Fratelli tutti at the tomb of the peacemaker Francis of Assisi. That was a symbol. Pope Francis formulates in Fratelli tutti his vision of a social and just society in a broad, peaceful policy context against the backdrop of global escalations. The core thesis of Fratelli tutti means that a society can only be just and peaceful as a society of fraternity and social friendship. More direct, directly, then in Laudato Si, he calls for a policy of fraternity, human dignity, and integrity of creation. Today, we have to interpret Fratelli Tutti under the impression of the Russian war against Ukraine with all its global consequences, it seems. On one hand, that Fratelli Tutti social utopia is farther away than ever. On the other hand, the analysis of society, the search for ways to a just and peaceful society, and the appeals to those with political responsibility are more important than ever. So he describes the decline of ethics in international actions and weakening of spiritual value and a sense of responsibility. The sense of belonging decreases, and the dream of building justice and peace together seems like the utopia of other times. And he sees the loss of fraternity, fraternal responsibility as the foundation of any civil society. Already in Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis had dealt with the serious social misdevelopment and summarized this in the sentence, "This economy kills." It kills people, their livelihood, it kills culture and humanity. In Laudato Si, he not only describes the ecological catastrophe as the consequences of the effects of destructive industrial societies, he also sees that the near end of some resources, a situation arises that favors new wars justified by noble claims. And he wrote, with the view of the nuclear and biological weapons that mentioned before also Petra, wars have to ever more perfect means of killing. Thinking about it again, Fratelli concludes that it is very difficult to speak of just wars. I come to the same point as Petra mentioned. The world is finding it harder to follow the slow path to peace. And the war begins with the violence against human dignity, with hunger, with misery and hardship. This model has no qualms about exploiting, throwing away, and even killing people. Wars, assassination, persecutions for racist or religious motives, so many acts of violence against human dignity have multiplied to such extent that Pope Francis writes in Fratelli Tutti of the world war in sections. With the Ukraine war, we see the new phase of this development is going on. And Pope Francis refers to the causes. Neither private poverty, nor interest of financial sector should take precedences over social goods. This is why the Christian tradition, so Pope Francis, has never recognized the right to private property as an absolute and has emphasized the social function of every forms of private property. Not the ownership of property, but the ownership of inalienable human dignity. Such kind of property, of ownership, must be the fundamental legal principle. Peace means the holistic development based on culture of fraternity and social friendship, democracy, freedom and justice, and a policy based on dignity of individual development and of the common goods for all. Peace means working towards a global ethic of solidarity and cooperation, working towards a future shaped by independence and co-responsibility with the whole human family. Co-responsibility, I think this term, it's a key point. He refers to the need for a legal, political, and economic world order that promotes and directs international cooperation towards the development of all people in solidarity. And that means overcoming social injustice and the perspective of development for all. with these words of Pope Francis, is very close to the socialist as well as in his analysis of global conflicts. Like him, we share the concern for the preservation of humanity. Climate change requires a radical change towards to a post-fossil mode of production. But such a change can only be sustainable and socially just if it is designed in such a way that all regions have a perspective for development, especially those economies that are based on fossil energies, that include also Russian, of course. The question from the Marxist is, how is it possible under the condition of capitalism? From a Marxist perspective, this includes a permanent accumulation, Axel Gehring was mentioned it, in the interest of the profit. The struggle to expand sphere of influence, access to resources, to maximize profit, that is the DNA of capitalism. And under the intensifying of global conflict, capitalism repeatedly drives to new quality of wars. Rosa Luxemburg wrote, the more energetically capital uses militarism to assimilate the means of production and labor of non-capitalist countries and societies through world and colonial policy, the more energetically the same militarism works at home in the capitalist country. The more violence capitalists in the world throws militarism, the more it depresses the condition of existence of all working classes. Capitalism thus transforms the daily history of capital accumulation on the world stage into a continuous change of political and social catastrophe. It is a potentialization and potential of contradictions. That is what we see today. The multiple crises and going in different catastrophic ways. The strength of the Marxist approach is aimed above all of this, the structure of capitalism and the relations and the mode of production with the consequences of the class society. From the Marxist point, both must be overcome as the causes of war, the exploitation and the oppression. But the abolition of the contradiction between social production and private capitalist appropriation based on the private ownership of the means of production can only be overcome through the struggle of the working class. The history of all existing society is the history of the class struggle, Marx in the manifesto. And at the same time, Marx understands the self-liberation of the working class at the core of a more comprehensive liberation, a liberation of the individual being, the basis for the liberation of all. This double task of liberation is still underestimated in two directions. To build a broader alliance than the working class, and with regard to the importance of the individual person in it. Previous attempts to build a socialism without exploitation and oppression were partly at the expense of the interests and dignity of the individual and of the social and cultural groups and communities. A partly instrumental relationship to the individual, to the right to self-determination and self-organization went hand in hand with the path of violence and the party dictatorship. In Fratelli tutti, and this is the few central differences, is the class struggle a problem of division and no way to solve global conflict. Pope Francis replaced the class struggle with the social and political love. The task of political love in his understanding is to ensure the development of the commons for all and to prevent the exploiters from the exploiting. Love instead the struggle. There is a problem for the left. The analytical framework based on the class antagonism as a central level of references has the consequences that pacifist strategies have their limits where the possibility of the transformational or revolutionary overcoming of capitalist relations can be blocked. In practice, this could lead to the double standards in the consideration of violence. My colleague Axel Gehring gave me this example. Lenin wanted peace in the sense of the ending of the First World War, ending the civil war of the proletarians against each other, and at the same time transforming into a war of class against each other. But precisely the left history teaches that the path of transformation cannot be successful if the path itself is not emancipative in the dignity of the human being does not remain of the central importance. A society of human dignity is the common thread of Fratelli tutti, the common concern as well as the common search for social alternative for the survival of humanity brings socialists and Christians together in the dialogue in the times of war. Only together we can be saved. That is one of the biggest sentence of our position paper. That leads me to following questions. What can be done to eliminate the causes of wars with their global effects and to enable a social ecological transformation as the only way of human emancipation for a life in dignity, social security, and solidarity? And the second question, what could be the concrete conditions for a sustainable peace in Europe and also between Russia and Ukraine? Of course, Fratelli tutti couldn't give this answer because it was written before. But the analysis of international politics include a number of factors of escalations. The danger of the war already looming since 2014. And this is also why Pope Francis is warning us, every war is a failure of politics. And Pope Francis pointed out principles that can be useful. The first, the sovereignty of the people must be respected. Second, there needs to be limits on power. And that means limits of political, economic, military, and technological power. It needs a legal system to regulate the claims and interests. And in the view of the beginning of nation state, this legal system must have transnational character. It needs a form of world political authority, more effective world organizations that guarantee the common goods, the fight against hunger, misery, and defense of the human rights worldwide. And it needs a reform of both. And that was the interesting point for myself, not only to defense the reform of the United Nations and also in the same time, also the international economic and financial order. That has to be come together. And all this question, we are also discussing as the left. That means for me and for us, it is time to form a broadest possible alliance against the war. Armament and the nuclear threat, it has to be a time of humanism, of the practice and cooperation. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Connie. Thank you very much. I want to tell the speakers, because you don't see it, that we're followed with a lot of interest. Most of the attendees are still here. So just to motivate you a little bit more. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Wolfgang Palaver, professor at the University of Innsbruck, of the Catholic and Social Thought here in Austria. He has published on peace, ethics, and democracy. His most recent research project focused on Gandhi's concept of nonviolence And his English books are René Girard's Mimetic Theory in 2013, Transforming the Sacred into Saintliness, Reflecting on Violence and Religion with René Girard, or Girard, I guess, The European Wars of Religion in 2016, and the Palgrave Handbook of Mimetic Theory and Religion 2017, Mimetic Theory and World Religions 2018. I will be posting the bio of Wolfgang also in the chat. Wolfgang, the floor is yours. You have also a presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I will also share my screen, and hopefully it works. I think you all see the screen now. And I will address the question, is nonviolence a possible path toward peace building? So it's a special question that we discussed today, and I will go forward in 4 steps. I will talk about the problems of a pacifism. I will emphasize what Petra already mentioned, that nonviolence is a more efficient and sustainable way. Thirdly, nonviolence is not a recipe for all cases. That's also important to understand. And fourthly, nonviolence becomes a necessity in a world of highly destructive weapons. Also, that has been addressed by Petra already. So the first step will be the following. There is a problem, a misunderstanding of the tradition of nonviolence, if you understand it in the sense of a pacifism. Pacifism is a very broad concept and has its own problems. So therefore, I always prefer to talk about the tradition of nonviolence, not so much about pacifism. And I can follow in that regard Mahatma Gandhi, who maintained that his concept of satyagraha, that was his special Indian term for nonviolence, meaning love force or truth force, should not be translated with pacifism. He was always aware and was very much critical of passive understandings, meaning doing nothing against evil or injustice. So nonviolence is an active concept. It means resisting evil nonviolently. It doesn't mean not resisting evil. It means resisting evil nonviolently. So the proper translation of a verse in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:39, which is usually translated, do not resist evil, and which would lead, and historically has led, to a pacifism, should be properly translated as exegetes and specialists of the New Testament today tell us, do not violently resist evil. Pope Francis, in his message of 2017 to the World Day of Peace, which was very much dedicated to nonviolence, explicitly underlines this active understanding when he writes, nonviolence is sometimes taken to mean surrender, lack of involvement, and passivity. But this is not the case. He refers to those 4 examples Petra already mentioned, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Abdul Ghaffar Khan, and Lema Gobwe. And he continues later on in this document saying, peace building through active nonviolence is the natural and necessary complement to the Church's continuing efforts to limit the use of force by the application of moral norms. So he states that nonviolence has become a necessary complement to the tradition, the criteria of the so-called just war traditions. And in order to understand the problems of pacifism, we could just read Karl von Clausewitz's book on war, which not only influenced Lenin and many other things, because he makes a very interesting paradoxical observation that he says the attacker wants peace, whereas the defender wants wars. He, for instance, wrote in regard to Napoleon, the aggressor is always peace-loving, as Bonaparte always claimed to be. He would prefer to take over our country unopposed. To prevent his doing so, one must be willing to make war and be prepared for it. So if we think about the Ukraine war, of course, the Russian aggressor wants peace, and the Ukraine doesn't want peace, so therefore it fights against this occupation. And that's not only the case in international relations between states or between an imperial power and a state. It's also, as already our socialist or Marxist colleagues emphasized, a question of social justice. So it means an exploiting society, an unjust society, of course, wants peace. And those who are exploited, those who are suffering from exploitation, they don't want to have this kind of peace. So we have to go, as Petra already said, in the direction of just peace. So I come to my second step, and that's just what Petra already referred to, but I make it a little bit more explicit and show you the picture of the book. There was a very interesting, a very important study by Erika Genovet and Maria Stefan in their book, Why Civil Resistance Works. And they studied 312 cases between 1940 and 2006 and came to the conclusion that nonviolent resistant methods have been more than twice as effective in achieving limited and full success among anti-regime campaigns. So nonviolence is definitely more efficient, more sustainable, more long-lasting, contributing to peace. This study shows the efficiency of nonviolent resistance inside a state or inside a society against unjust regime. The problem, however, is that we do not have a lot of examples or really good proven examples of nonviolent resistance between states. That's much more difficult. So this book doesn't give you an immediate hint or insight what to do, for instance, in the case of Ukraine. I come, therefore, and that follows quite logically to my third point. Nonviolence is not a recipe for all cases. In a sudden act of aggression, nonviolent means may not be available. Mahatma Gandhi himself called the military defense of Poland against Nazi Germany almost nonviolent. He, after 1939, so after the Second World War broke out, he again and again used this paradoxical formulation, almost nonviolent, even saying we should give this word almost full value. He does not only address cases like the aggression of Nazi Germany, he also talks about women who are raped, women who even might use a dagger to defend themselves. He also calls them almost non-violent. So therefore, in the tradition of Gandhi, there is no clear-cut, no black and white separation between violence and non-violence. There is more like a continuum. He always preferred non-violence wherever it's possible. And he was quite aware that violent means are always in danger of escalating, but there are situations where non-violent means may be not available. So non-violence is a long-term concept that needs a lot of preparation, and human society as such has not spent a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort really to develop those long-term concepts of social defense for a whole society. So if we summarize this third point, we can compare it or distinguish between an urgent surgery, which is sometimes necessary, and the long-term effort to prevent sickness, and nonviolence is definitely close to the second. And I come already to my fourth point, which was also indirectly addressed by Petra, where she showed us the mushroom of the nuclear explosion of Nagasaki. So my fourth point, my fourth step is nonviolence becomes a necessity in a world of highly destructive weapons, which is also strongly highlighted in Pope Francis' encyclical Fratelli Tutti. So I again turn to Clausewitz, and I read Clausewitz now with René Girard, whose last book, Battling to the End, was a study of Clausewitz, and shows that if you read Clausewitz very carefully, you will realize that Clausewitz was aware that there is a strong tendency connected to war to escalate to extremes, and this made Girard to write an apocalyptic book. So the English translation is Battling to the End, but the German is Im Angesicht der Apokalypse, which emphasizes and aligns this apocalyptic dimension that is going along with this observation of an escalation of violence or war to extremes. And I think all of us are quite well aware that we are currently really in a very difficult stage of our world. You may be aware that physicists and scientists established the doomsday clock in 1947, showing us every year what is the stage of the world, how close we are to a self-annihilation of our world, to a self-destruction of our world. And just 2 weeks ago, in the end of January, the doomsday clock was set for 2023. And for the first time in the history of this doomsday clock, the experts show us that we are 90 seconds to midnight because of the nuclear danger, because of the war in Ukraine, because of the climate crisis, and because of the disruptive nature of the way we use and the social media are established right now. Again, we can refer to Gandhi in this case, because Gandhi, he was killed 80 years ago, 60 years ago, sorry, in the end of January 1948, but he still lived when the first nuclear bombs were thrown on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in one of his reflections on the nuclear bomb in 1946, he wrote, "Unless now the world adopts nonviolence, it will spell certain suicide for mankind." And this is also very clear in Pope Francis' eyes, because in Fratelli Tutti, he says the total elimination of nuclear weapons becomes both a challenge and a moral and humanitarian imperative. This was quite a new step for the Church in the last couple of years, because still during the Second Vatican Council, there was a lot of discussion how to deal with nuclear weapons, and the majority at that time thought you can use nuclear weapons for deterrence if you don't use them. But today the Pope says we have to go a step forward. We really have to seek the total elimination of nuclear weapons. And I conclude my impulse with this longer quote, partly already referred to by Petra, but repetition is the mother of study. So I read the longer version of it in Pope Francis' message on the World Day of Peace, Nonviolence as a Style of Politics. He wrote, "I would like to reflect on nonviolence as a style of politics for peace. I ask God to help all of us to cultivate nonviolence in our most personal thoughts and values. May charity and nonviolence govern how we treat each other as individuals, within society and in international life. When victims of violence are able to resist the temptation to retaliate, they become the most credible promoters of nonviolent peacemaking. In the most local and ordinary situations and in the international order, may nonviolence become the hallmark of our decisions, our relationships and our actions, and indeed of political life in all its forms." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Wolfgang. Thank you. Also, congratulations from the other speakers. So I think this last hour has been quite intense. All four of you have tried to explore the questions that we set to answer. So I promised we would have a second moderated shorter round where you get maximum, let's say, 4 to 5 minutes, in which I do hope that each one of you will try to enter this dialogue we're hosting and cherry pick arguments from the other side, being the Christian or the Marxist side, and try to see what are the possibilities of common work, of working together for peace, but at the same time, what are the milestones, the stepping stones towards that way that we need to discuss about perhaps more deeply. A reminder for the audience, this is only the first of 3 webinars we're planning, so the beginning of good work. So thank you again for the patience. And I think I will continue with the series, like the Reihenfolge, that I will call you at the same time like I did before. So Axel first, then Petra, then Connie, then Wolfgang. Okay? So Axel, the floor would be yours. Or not. Oh, did Axel just leave? Oh no, he's here.
Sorry, you know, I'm a little bit ill, and so I made a little mistake, and instead of switching the micro, I switched off the video camera. Yeah, when it comes to the question of war and peace, and also the question of violence against the evil, or the question of non-violence against the evil. Let's put it like this. It could be the question of active non-violence, could be maybe the most common element between us. Then we are having a very big problem, because it is related to capitalist rule and its structure. It is a very impersonal rule. So the power structures are very much in a way that they can be hardly too directly addressed. Therefore, we have always the problem to think in which direction we have to address our non-violence. I mean, on what can be the active non-violence. The active non-violence could be to create already a form of living in which the humans have overthrown all conditions in which people, or in which as a human is a debased, enslaved, and neglected being. So this is what we already know from Karl Marx, I would say this is the categorical imperative of Marxism. So it would be a way of thinking, of creating spaces where this forms of living can be established. But there is a problem for which I cannot give you a solution, which I just can identify as a problem. How to establish them in a world which is very hostile against it, because the capitalist relation itself would immediately push into it, would immediately bring it again under the interest to absorb it. And therefore, I can only raise questions and don't have so strong answers.
Thank you, Axel, for this. I think the most important pillar of our discussion, the way we want to have it, is honesty. So saying we have questions, more questions than answers, is an honest approach to the problem, I think. And this is what we want to do. Before I give the floor to Petra, also for her second round, I just wanted to remind everyone, because today is the 15th of February, it was today, 20 years ago, that millions of people took the streets against the war in Iraq. You remember, it was actually for Europe's left a very important moment in the history of organization. And unfortunately, we couldn't stop the war, even if millions of people took the streets, and the demonstrations of back then are quite impressive for the people that lived through them and organized them. At the same time, today there was, this was mentioned by Petra before, also the importance of misinformation, of communicating the ethical justification of war and violence in this sense. We had today this huge story that broke out by Haaretz, more or less saying that there are companies that have been manipulating democratic processes for the last 15 years, particularly in the peripheries of the world. Coming back to Axel and his arguments. And of course, just to put this also in this discussion, all of you mentioned the nuclear threat. We are now in a situation where an international treaty exists. The TPNW, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, has been signed by dozens of countries, but of course not nuclear powers. So these are just milestones in order to take our discussion a little bit to today again. And Petra, the floor is yours.
Well, there were some connecting lines that came to my mind listening to Axel and then also Cornelia and of course Wolfgang. But as I said in the beginning, I was drawing a lot on a paper by Wolfgang. So that's quite clear why there are so many connections there. But as to Axel, I thought when I was talking about this concept of just peace, that really sets a lot of importance on also structural violence and the profound reasons for violence, that this could really be something that connects us, because as you explained to us, Marxist analysis really talks a lot about these underlying structures of injustice that are brought forth by the capitalist system. So I think that could be a kind of a common ground from which to move on. And listening to you, Connie, I thought that when you were talking about this scarcity of resources and the danger of what some people call climate wars or wars over resources, that, for example, also with Pope Francis talking a lot about that in Laudato Si, we really have a lot of common ground here. Something that I wanted to ask you, Connie, was, did I get you correctly that you said that this Marxist notion of class struggle really could be something that blocks a peaceful solution to the challenges we are facing, because it makes this, it kind of gives us this opposition between the working class and the elites, and that this notion in itself also makes dialogue or peaceful solutions more difficult. Was that what you said? And maybe that would be the bridge, so you could continue.
Also many thanks also for your question. So it's not so easy to answer, because for the left, especially for the radical left, and I'm speaking from the point of the radical left, is the class struggle a normal term, also a classical term, because when we are fighting against capitalism, then we are fighting against the bourgeois class, and not only, it is not only the bourgeois class, it's also the structure beyond. And that means the question of exploiting and also the question of oppression. And the question is it possible, and that is a key question for us, under the condition of the capitalist system, because we are not able, if you see the weakness of the radical left in this time, to change completely the capitalist system. Also, what could be the next step? And in this moment, we have to realize at first the class struggle. Also to think the question of the surviving of the civilization and surviving of the humanity. You can't speak from the class point, but you have to also in the same time to overcome in the meaning of to think broader, not only from your class, you can thinking from your class point, but you have to looking for who could be part of the alliance in the broader things to build a peace building as a peace building alliance. And that means we have to understand that not only the working class is in the interest of peace, also people, partly also from the bourgeois class, will also be interested in peace because the survival of this civilization is also interest of these people. And to think in the broader things, that is sometimes not so easy to discuss. That means not to be blockaded, but in concerning the peace question. But what we are discussing in this moment, for example, is the question of sovereignty of the people and sovereignty of the countries. Is it under, so when we want, if we think this, is it useful to defend this sovereignty with weapons or not? What is the position of the left in this moment? And you know, maybe you know, that the positions between the left completely different. And what I see is that these differences at first is connected with the concrete position of the people in their country. It's a concrete, it's a complete other things if you are discussing from the German point, from the Spanish point, or if you discuss it from the Polish point, if you discuss it near to the aggression of the Russian aggression. And so we have to see in which way we can formulate elements for the non-violent steps together, not only as from the class struggle point to overcome the class struggle point in this. And I think one problem is for me to see not only from the class struggle point, also to go from the just war into the just peace. This concept connected with the question of humanity, dignity, with the question of solidarity and social justice, and connected with the strategy of decommodification. In this moment, we can looking for a peace as a common way of discussing, a positive way of peace, a positive thinking of peace with the sustainable directions. Also, for us, is it, I have the feeling we have to find, and you see my thinking and my looking for words. We are on the way to bring together the class perspective with the perspective of the civilization. But what we have, of course, also to discuss, and that is necessary, especially in this time. Who are the winner of this war? Who are the winner of this development? And what is blockading with the war in this moment? And who are not the winner? Who are the people? They are in misery, they are in poorness, and they don't are able to find ways for emancipation. And Pope Francis give us the possibility to looking for from the view from all people, from the civilization point. And that could be helpful for us to find a stronger connection with the class question, with the question of survival, until the question of the positive way of peace.
Thank you, Connie and Wolfgang.
Yeah, I try to be as short as possible. I think that the positions are even closer as the presentations might have shown, because I am addressing Connie's paper. I don't think that Pope Francis is really substituting class struggle for love, because he has a very interesting double concept, because he strongly emphasizes also the necessity of conflict. So I refer always to his book, Let Us Dream, that came out at about the same time at Fratelli Tutti. And he says, if we neglect conflicts, if we neglect social divisions and so on, we are going in the wrong direction. But I mean, you are right insofar that he also claims unity is more important than conflict. So he tries to say we need, where are conflicts, those conflicts have to be solved, they have to be struggled, they have to be fight. But in the end, we need to aim at unity that is even more important than conflict. And in some way, I think we would all agree that in the end, we should achieve unity. The question is the way to it. I also agree with Axel in his criticism of liberal peace. I think liberal peace is not possible, and it's a chimera, it's wishful thinking. And I would like to address very shortly what Petra and you, Connie, addressed about international order, world authority. And I think this is the most difficult thing humanity ever has tried to solve, because I mean, we should not think that this is easy to solve. Not only for capitalism, for many other things, but we should do everything in order to strengthen that. Because if you would have a international order, as you, Connie, lined it out, then the question of sovereignty of the people, sovereignty of countries would look different. So it would not be that important. But what we face today is concepts of imperialism that is, of course, connected to capitalism and imperial systems. We should not accept, and we have to fight against imperialism in all its ways. I also think that at least Pope Francis and the recent development of Catholic social teaching is indirectly also addressing capitalism, in the sense that the Pope is calling for a different lifestyle, for a different way we deal economically with each other. So this is, of course, the basis. If we do not make progress on this level, the other problems will become much more difficult, or we will not be able to solve them.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. There are two questions now in the Q&A box, both from Franz Kronreif. I will read both of them since it's the only two right now, and maybe you can take turns in answering them. Not everybody has to answer both questions. You know how to be laconic with your words. So the first question is there an example where an attempt was made to switch to non-violence in a war that was already in progress? If so, what was the result? This is question number one. And the question number two, is it at least theoretically conceivable in the class struggle that the two classes in conflict with each other try as a method to think themselves into the other? These are the two questions now in front of me. Perhaps you can take turns. I see Connie being ready, and then Axel, and then Wolfgang, and then Petra. Maybe switch a little bit the panel. Or okay. Axel. Yeah, Axel, go. Yeah.
Shall I answer? When it comes to the question of ongoing wars where there was an attempt to achieve peace or to successfully realize it, if I understood this question right, I would think the First World War is a very good example. It was not fought to the very end. It was not like the Second World War when the Nazi regime surrendered, when they were almost completely fought down and every village of the German Empire was already under Allied control. No, the First World War ended when the German army was still staying in France and when there was a kind of popular unrest of people saying they don't want to even further fight this lost war. And the other question, if it is at least theoretically convincible in the class struggle that the two classes in conflict with each other try as a method to sink themselves into each other, I think that happens very often. We have to understand that class struggle we shall not translate with class war. Class struggle can take the form of class war. But class struggle is already when you're on your daily base negotiating as a trade unionist with the employer a new treaty about employment, about wages. So the very basic elements of a class struggle found themselves already taking form of such negotiations. And this has reasons, because for the laborers, it is too risky to enter always in a direct and violent confrontation with the employers. And for the capitalists, it's also too risky to have always an unmediated class conflict running. So this is something we already have. The point is that a capitalist order turns violence very often when very basic relations of this order seem to be under threat.
Thank you, Axel. Anybody else wants to take up on these two questions? Wolfgang?
I maybe to the first, I do not have a real very good example in the direction Franz was asking, but we have examples of nonviolent resistance in warlike situations, like the people in Czechoslovakia when they used nonviolent means against the occupation by the Warsaw Pact. We also have today examples of nonviolent resistance in some cities and villages in the Ukraine. We should not forget that, so we should emphasize that. But on the other hand, I mean, if a war is really broken out and the preparation is not there and so on, so I addressed that question already indirectly, that nonviolence, you cannot switch to nonviolence in a situation of attack if you are not really prepared to that. And we have not yet developed on a really national level this kind of social defense and that would mean to put a lot of effort, money, study in it, and all the money goes into the military channel, because as we all know, in 2021, for the first time, the worldwide money was above $2 trillion for the first time, and that was before the war broke out in the Ukraine. So this is the thing. The second thing, I think also we should emphasize class struggle as a struggle for a unity that is just. And I think about Gandhi was using that method. So I think also the book that I mentioned, of Genovese and Stefan shows that it's possible to overcome conflicts by seeking common ground in a struggle. So I think that's the advantage of nonviolence, that nonviolence can help us to fight those struggles in a way that is seeking peace in that way.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Cornelia?
I think the differences between class war and class struggle is very important, because this gives us the bridge to looking for in which way is it possible to fight for a positive peace way, for a positive peace project against the commodification of life, against the oppression of people, against exploiting of people. In this moment, could it be helpful also to also build a positive agenda? That means when we are looking for what are the most important problems in Europe and worldwide, that is a climate change. What we are seeing in this moment is the militarization, and a lot of resources is going in the direction of militarization and not in direction of measures against the climate change, also to avoid the climate change or to block the climate change. And to make this more visible, it is in both directions. It's from the question of the class struggle, but also from the question of civilization, to survive as a civilization. And I have one problem, what I'm thinking. Axel was mentioned, for example, the stagnation of globalization and the increasing of conflicts. Connected with this development is also the question of protectionism. My country first. And in this moment, you see on one hand that we need the transnational authority, and at the same time we are seeing the increasing development of protectionism against the transnational solidarity. You think, as we have seen some elements of that also in the pandemic. My country at first, we want to have the vaccine and no give this, for example, to the African countries. And under the new situation of new quality of conflicts, it's a question for myself. In which way is it possible to stop such kind of development and to bring it in the direction what Pope Francis also has described, in direction of more power for the transnational institutions, and with the knowledge that we have to overcome, we have to reform the transnational institutions. In which way is it possible to make the concrete steps in this direction? That I'm also thinking when we are speaking about, yes, in the moment of aggression, is it very difficult to find non-violent steps? But we have also to think, what is after the war? What could be the sustainable peace after this conflicts, with the direction that the new conflicts is going on? Many thanks.
Thank you, Connie. So there is one question in the chat, but I think this is more, it's a good question, but it's more a topic, I think, for the next webinar we're planning. I'm going to read it out loud. Would it be possible to create international alliances around the issue of decommodification of social reproduction? And there is a comment by Claudia Kriegelsteiner in the Q&A saying that in her observation, in her opinion, the sole mentioning of a peaceful solution or actions that are towards non-violent, peace-oriented activities is more or less not happening. Like it's not mentioned in the news. Any mention of peace is immediately criticized or spoken down under. Perhaps we can take the last 9 minutes we have together to talk a little bit about that. I think it is of great importance, this question, how to continue discussing peace in a very, very toxic public discourse environment perhaps is something where you can exchange a little bit now. Would one of you like to start? So Wolfgang and Connie, you're unmuted, so I don't know if you would like to start.
I'm not unmuted.
You are unmuted.
I'm unmuted, yeah. Let me just underline what I said in my first step. I think one of the reasons that peace movement, nonviolence has a bad press or no press at all is also that some of those concepts are not very well thought out and are often positioned or seen as concepts of passive just doing nothing. So to recommend to Ukraine do nothing because this will cause war and violence, this is not a position you can really say. And so therefore we have to emphasize much more what it means to resist non-violently. That means to resist without being drawn into this escalation, without mirroring the attacker. So without demonizing the attacker. So I think for the Ukraine right now, if I would be an advice of them, the most important thing is to calibrate all kinds of defense, not to be drawn on this escalating spiral that will lead to destruction and to nowhere. So really to be very careful. And so therefore, this concept of almost non-violent violence from Gandhi is also very important. If you do not understand that, then we had reactions in the German press that people said, please stop talking about Gandhi because this is not the solution at all. But the way the people talked, some of the people talked about Gandhi has nothing to do with Gandhi's insights in those things.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Anyone else? Axel?
I mean, when it comes to the question of how to talk about peace and non-violence in a very hostile environment, I would come with a very analysis of the military situations here. I cannot go now in details. I'm doing it very often, but then I would talk now really long. But I will start with the conclusion. The conclusion is currently it is very open who is going to win the war. It is even not clear if it will end with a stalemate or if one side of both sides will drop out at a certain point because they cannot mobilize further for the war. So that means going further with this war is for every participant extremely risky. You don't know if you will win the war. So long as the war is going on, you're risking to lose it. Then you're paying an extremely high price. And with this in your mind, you may not be able to enter directly into negotiations. But with this in your mind, you're already at the point where you can evaluate the costs of making the war. And this is a very important tool, which is bringing the ratio back into a situation where the ratio is destroyed by a circling spiral of escalation, which itself is very irrational.
Thank you, Axel. I saw that Petra also muted herself. Petra, I will take you first and then Connie.
Well, I'm not at all an expert in the Ukrainian war, but I listened to a very interesting discussion last night with political scientists and military strategists. And they, even though they had different opinions, they agreed that the weapons being given to the Ukraine, or that there would have been 10 times as many heavy weapons given to the Ukraine, that there might be a chance for the Ukraine to win this war. So under the conditions right now, what they agreed is that they will, both parties will enter into a new phase of the war, which will cause extremely many casualties. So it was, even though they were on different sides, they agreed that there will be a very brutal phase ahead of us, and with no real chances for the Ukraine under the conditions right now to win, or even to gain a lot of territory back. So against that background, I guess, as you said, there needs to be a way to come to the point where peace talks are started. And what came to my mind first, considering the question of Franz Kronreif, was the example of a very different war, but also very brutal war, the civil war in Rwanda, where there was a little community, the Sanegidio, who had no interest for themselves, but who facilitated the peace talks. And I wonder whether such an initiative of a third party not having any interests on either side might have a chance to facilitate steps into the direction of peace and nonviolence.
Thank you, Petra. You will see there are two more questions, comments in the Q&A box. We said we will do 2 hours, so I'm just saying that we have another 7 minutes theoretically. And of course, we can go on longer, but it's late already. So I would give the floor to Connie. But before I do so, and because it was mentioned also, I mean, you all mentioned international institutions. We're now discussing the last 5 minutes. What about negotiating during war? In what level? In how it could be possible? Can one negotiate peace and so on? I mean, in 10 days, less than 10 days, in a week from now, the OECD Parliamentary Assembly is supposed to take place in Vienna. And it seems that because Vienna is the official seat of the OECD in Europe, it has an obligation of allowing travel to all delegations. So as you can imagine, there is an immense pressure on Austria right now to boycott the participation of the Russian delegation in the OECD meeting. Why am I mentioning this? Because it seems in the environment in which we are, the international spaces where these negotiations, or even the discussion, if there could be negotiations, the spaces where this can happen, they become smaller and smaller. And I guess this is also something one has to consider. Connie, I would like to give you the floor. You would be the last of all of us, and then I would close the discussion. Is it okay for everyone?
For me, yes. I'm not sure that I have to say so important things, but I think the role of the media we should also mention, because the rhetoric of the military rhetoric of the media, of the public media, especially in Germany, I see is one of the dangerous points to thinking about the peace agenda. Also, what I see in the public media is no doubts concerning what the German government is doing, especially what is doing and speaking also the foreign minister in Germany. We are in the war with Russia. That was a real danger sentence. And I can't understand that the media, especially the public media, are not able to give some thinking about the peace agenda. And I think, of course, we should support the peace initiatives in the different countries, also in the Ukraine and Russia. But at the other time, is it very dangerous to make this for the Russian peace initiatives in Russian, for the people in Russia? And so we have to see in which way is it possible to support. But what we should do to make in our own countries initiatives concerning the peace agenda. And what I see in Germany, it's a complete new alliance between the people, one guy, as one woman from the left, and one feminist, and she was not in the past connected with left wings, especially with the radical left. Sarah Wagenknecht and Alice Schwarzer. Alice Schwarzer is a real famous feminist woman in Germany, maybe not only in Germany, also in Europe. And both never had done something together, but they started a petition, and more than 440,000 people signed this. And that is a great moment in this moment to understand in this moment of peace fighting, we need also unusual alliances as a moment for find ways for peace. And not only to see, is it a left wing, is it not a left wing? We have to looking for, of course, we have to go in clear distance against the far right. Of course, they are using this moment also for them, their strategy. In distance of this, but to looking for in the broader way, for looking for peace, that is one moment of the agenda also for the German left.
So thank you very much, Connie. If everyone agrees, I would like to close this webinar now. Thank you to the over 30 attendees that kept with us for the last 2 hours. Thank you to all 50, because about 20 people left us in the last 5 minutes. Thank you to the speakers for preparing and all the time you had to sacrifice to prepare this webinar. Thank you to Luisa, who is not visible and did a lot of the organizational work. And see you on the 22nd of March, where at 16:30, where we continue with the series exploring the common ground in peace thoughts for the Marxist and the Christian side. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.